We welcome, Dr. Lines. Thank you so much for joining me on Flipping Tables. I know that we had to jump around my schedule with traveling and your schedule with traveling, so I'm glad we could make it work.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
And we've talked a little bit, obviously, right before I started recording this. Would just love to know your journey, where you're from, how you got into ministry, what has shaped you into the leader you are today, and just tell the listeners, if they haven't seen your social media content, who you are.
So I grew up in rural Southwest Missouri in a small little town called Monette, Missouri. It had about a population of around 7,000 people. And oddly enough, my grandpa was a Disciples of Christ minister, which is the denomination that I'm ordained in, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And I grew up in a small little church that he had pastored, and he retired when I was around seven, and another pastor came in, and it was, despite being in the small little rural community, a progressive congregation. And so the first time that I heard about LGBT affirmation, for instance, I heard it in church in rural Missouri, which
Wow,
is
that's
not an
surprising.
experience that a lot of people have, right? It is surprising because it wasn't a message I was getting in the culture around me. It was a message that I heard at home. My parents always taught me that I should care about everybody, that I should love everybody. But the first time that I really heard that called out as affirming LGBT folks, that was in church. And so my model for ministry was my pastor had this weekly column in the local newspaper. The editor happened to be a member of our church. And so he was always writing about kind of progressive political and theological issues in that paper. And it just made everyone in town really mad. And so I grew up hearing every week, "Oh, you go to that church, you're probably going to hell." And so that was just my
You've been
normal,
training for
you
the
know.
backlash your whole life. You're like, I've been
That's
here, I
right.
can do this.
I can do this. In fact, I thought that's kind of what ministry was because that was my whole example. So I started feeling called to ministry around the time I was in middle school. I just thought, in this small town, the place where I see good stuff happening is in my church, is in religious communities. It was the place where I saw social justice work happening. It was the place where I saw advocacy happening, the place where I saw legislative change, at least advocacy for that happening. And so I thought, I think maybe I'm called to ministry. And so I knew that from that early age, and I went into college knowing that that's what I wanted to do. But I decided to go to a secular religious studies program because I wanted to learn the the actual history of the Bible. I didn't want to be taught what I ought to believe. I wanted to determine that for myself based on what we could know historically about the Bible. So my training was really in the social sciences and the approach to the biblical text from a social science perspective. So I was really grounded in, say, the historical critical method of biblical interpretation, that really formed how I approached the Bible from the beginning. And so then when I went off to seminary, I went to Yale Divinity School, a lot of people really were, as they were introduced to the historical critical method for the first time and they really began to kind of pick apart the Bible, that was really problematic for their faith. But for me, it was just kind of an essential part of my faith. It had formed the way that I viewed the Bible. I kind of grew up hearing that, and then it was reinforced at the secular university in this religious studies program. And so for me, as I was training for ministry, I was really incorporating the theological pieces that we were talking about in seminary with what I knew to be factually true about the biblical text. And so I think that meant that I just approached the biblical text maybe a little bit differently than a lot of people who were training for ministry did. And so I was lucky to be a part of a denomination that believes in the responsible freedom of belief. And so,
Now that's a
allowed
line.
me to develop.
Responsible freedom of belief.
Yes, and I think that's important, right? Because a lot of times people will say, "Oh, well, you can just believe whatever you want." Like, that's not true. You don't just believe whatever you want because some things are clearly not authentic to the teachings of Jesus. And I think fundamentalist Christianity is a pretty good indicator of how you can call yourself a Christian and do things that are completely contrary to the teachings of Jesus. That's not responsible freedom of belief. So you don't just believe anything, but the bounds are wider, right? And we believe that there are some things that you just can't know. That there are a lot of things that you can't know. But if you're striving to follow the teachings of Jesus, then there are ethical stances that he was pretty clear about. Say immigration, Jesus was real clear about welcoming the stranger, and all kinds of issues. I think that Jesus was pretty clear about. So I think responsible freedom of belief was essential for me and kind of formed me as I was going into ministry.
Yeah. And
And
when
then
you
I
went into that secular program, were there things
yeah.
that you learned about biblical history that you found really jarring? Was there anything that stands out in your mind that you learned you're like, "Ooh, wow, that's different."
A lot of people, as they discovered that the Gospels, for instance, were written decades after Jesus lived, and that it was difficult to tell what Jesus authentically said and what he did not say, that really shook people's faith. For me, I found it wonderfully liberative because everything made sense to me in that way. Like, well, okay, well, this is why there are contradictions in the Bible because people wrote that. And so for me, I was like, this is great because it allows me to understand why there are contradictions in the Bible. And that wasn't a challenge to my faith, that enhanced my faith because all of a sudden I could recognize where people got creative with who Jesus was versus what was more likely to have been historical. So for when I was introduced to the Jesus seminar, for instance, and the quest for the historical Jesus, uh, kind of differentiating between who the Jesus of history was versus the Christ of faith, that was for me one of the biggest steps forward in my faith. It actually allowed me to stay in Christianity because otherwise, if I had to believe a lot of what Christians say you have to believe, I couldn't be a Christian because I just don't think it's historically accurate. And so
Can you give us
the
some of the, because
quest for
I'm sure some of my listeners
yeah,
don't know the difference between, because I grew up in fundamentalism. So I'm sitting on the other side of, deep alt-right Christian nationalist fundamentalism.
yeah,
Would you
yeah.
mind kind of going through what some of those differences are between what the fundamentalists will say that Christ is versus what is likely historically accurate?
So I think you can say a few things about Jesus historically. I think you can say that he lived because that's something that I always get asked. Like, how do you even know that Jesus is real? Like, well, I think Jesus lived because there is extra biblical evidence of Jesus. There are Josephus, for instance, although not a contemporary, pretty close to the time that Jesus lived. It's also an unlikely story for people to have made up because if you look at stories, say in the Hebrew Bible, that are clearly inventions, like say the Exodus story, then they are stories in which God triumphs in an incredible way. That, for instance, all the Egyptians are kind of taken out, all the Canaanites are taken out. In the story of Jesus, you have to do a lot of fancy footwork for Jesus to look like the winner in that
Yeah.
because Jesus is crucified by the Romans. It looks like he lost. He also didn't do what the Messiah was supposed to do. The Messiah was supposed to overthrow the Romans and reestablish an earthly kingdom. Jesus didn't do that. So he didn't do what he was supposed to do. They killed him. And so the whole notion of the resurrection is something that you have to kind of create for Jesus to win. So I think you can say that Jesus lived. I think you can say he was born. I think you can say that he died for standing up to the Roman Empire because the cross was used exclusively in the Roman Empire for crimes of sedition. And so I think it's clear to say that Jesus was proclaiming the reign of God in contrast to the Roman Empire. and that he died. But a lot of the other things that Christians tend to believe about Jesus aren't historical. And we know that just because if we really believe in modern science, then we know that some of those things can't happen. And also, if we look to like what the motives were, we can see that those likely weren't historical. So let's take, for instance, the virgin birth. Like, well, we know scientifically that's not something that can happen.
Yeah.
We also know that if we use like a literary critical method, that that was a common literary device to talk about a person being special, having a miraculous birth. Buddha, for instance, was said to have been born of a virgin, right? There's
Yeah.
this great story about an elephant coming and entering Buddha's mother's side, right? So it was just a common framing device. But most importantly, the Roman emperor was said to have been born of a virgin. So that kind of stuff, if you're
Where it's like
looking
these
at,
borrowed elements that we see in other
yes,
stories and other histories. Yeah.
yeah, right.
A
They're
lot of
being
the
used there.
biblical, stories borrowing from ancient Egypt, for instance.
Yes, I mean, so Egyptian gods were also said to have had virginal births,
Mhm.
right? So it's a common framing device. So if you know that, when you see that, then you can recognize what's happening. And so that's an example of something that historically isn't accurate, that the historical person of Jesus didn't have happen, that the Christ of faith, that is the Christ that Christianity invented, said about Jesus. I think maybe one of the most important things to distinguish between like the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith is whether or not Jesus is God. So historical Jesus scholars tend to think that Jesus spent most of his time talking about the basileia of God, that is like the reign of God, the kingdom of God, that stood in contrast to the Roman Empire, and that is why he got crucified, because he was talking about allegiance, loyalty to something other than Rome. And so they crucified him for that. And then Jesus's followers, instead of focusing on the basileia of God, instead focused on Jesus. And so we saw a fundamental shift from the religion of Jesus to the religion about Jesus. And that happened really quickly. And
Well,
so I
yeah, because I
think
mean, it was what, at least 30 years until they started writing the Gospels. So at that point, it had simply been oral tradition that had been passed around from the disciples and followers. And then it became this very different conversation when pen was put to paper.
that's exactly right. The first gospel that we have in the New Testament is the Gospel of Mark, and it was written probably around 70 of the Common Era, so about 40 years after Jesus was crucified. And you can see a shift there, but like if you look at Mark and then you go and look at like Luke and Matthew, which were written about 15 years later, probably around 85 of the Common Era, that there is a higher Christology. So Jesus is portrayed as more divine in Matthew and Luke than he is in Mark. And like, we don't get a birth narrative in the Gospel of Mark. If you look to the original ending of the Gospel of Mark, there's not a resurrection story. That originally what happens in the Gospel of Mark is that the women come to the tomb and they don't find him and they run away scared. No explanation given. End of gospel. And then later editors went through and added the resurrection stories
When
there.
was that
And
story
so
added
then
to the Gospel of Mark?
it was so scholars don't know exactly. All they know is that the most ancient manuscripts do not contain that story.
That's
And so
incredible.
if you look in your footnotes, if you got a Bible with a footnotes, it will say, I think it's maybe verse 14 of that last chapter, that the footnotes will say the most ancient manuscripts end here. But I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have any way of knowing that because it's in there, right? And then by the time you get to the Gospel of John, which was written somewhere between 90 to 100 of the Common Era, so 60 to 70 years after Jesus had been crucified, Jesus and God are the same, one and the same. And so we can see, even just by reading the Gospels, the progression of a higher Christology. So I think that that's a pretty important distinction about who the historical person of Jesus was versus the Christ of faith. Now, for some people, maybe that's not an important distinction to make, but for me and for my faith, it's a real important distinction because it means that the Jesus that a lot of people follow is not the Jesus who really lived.
Yeah.
And for me, like as a Christian, like if I really want to be a Jesus follower, then don't I want to follow the Jesus who actually lived? Don't I want to follow the teachings that he actually taught instead of the ones that people invented? And so for me, that's a real important distinction. And so that's something that really has framed my faith and the way that I look at the world.
That's so incredible. And again, it's amazing to hear how foundationally for you, you saw all this positivity and this change coming from your church. And in mentally, I'm making notes, because I grew up exactly the opposite. My church was
Mm,
that the Bible is literally the infallible word of God, and that, homosexuality was like the absolute worst sin you could possibly commit, and the lies around abortion and the subjugation of women were so entrenched in my church's doctrine. And it took really until I was in my mid 20s to really
mm.
start to unravel that and realize, oh, this really isn't in alignment with what Jesus really seemed to believe, which was love God, love your neighbor. This just
Yeah.
isn't in alignment. So, at being, a minister and a leader of a church, how do you respond when people bring up those verses like Leviticus or the mention in Romans of homosexuality? When they approach you with that and they say, well, the Bible says this, how do you respond to that? Like, I know how I do, but I would love to know how you
Yeah.
do.
I think a lot of times people like to really latch on to these clobber passages, but one of the things that they almost always neglect to do is to read the context of these verses to understand what they're actually about. So I think like the starting point is always what what are the teachings of Jesus about how we are to approach ethics and humanity? And I think that one thing that we can say consistently about Jesus, and I think that's true no matter how we understand the biblical text, is that Jesus gave us the criterion of love. That Jesus's whole message was about loving one another. And he talked about that in a number of different ways. He talked about how we could do that in society, how we could, love even our neighbors. But I think it's true that when Jesus was asked what the most important commandments were, he said, "You love God, love others, and love so deeply you even love your enemies." So Jesus gave us the criterion of love, which I think, for starters, means that any theology that we develop must pass the criterion of love, or else it is not authentic theology to the teachings of Jesus,
Thank
period. So I think that that's a great place to start with people. Of course, then you get fundamentalists who like to try to manipulate that and say, well, I am loving my neighbor because I want to save them from an eternity in hell.
Yeah.
Also, not a
I don't
biblical
hate the
concept.
sinner, I hate the sin.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, hate the sin. Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I mean, hell's not a biblical concept, which is another aside. But I think that whenever we actually bother to contextualize these verses, all those arguments about sexual orientation and gender identity being sinful whenever they don't conform to our expected norms in 21st century America, I think that they all fall apart. So, for instance, if we take some of the clobber passages, like let's say we look at Leviticus, well, Leviticus in the opening chapter defines it as being for the people of Israel, which is both location, like geographically bound, and bound by culture. So it by its own definition does not apply to 21st century American Christians. which is why it's not a big deal if we're wearing clothes made out of more than one type of thread, right? Or we're eating shellfish, because it doesn't apply. Furthermore, the verses in Leviticus that talk about really gay male sex uh, is uh, is not talking about sexual orientation in the way that we understand it today, and scholars aren't exactly sure what it's talking about. So scholars debate this. They say, well, these phrases that are used in Leviticus, when they're used elsewhere in the Bible, they're actually condemning incest. So maybe that's what's being talked about here. Or there was a tradition of Canaanite temple prostitution. Maybe that's what they're talking about here. Or, well, in the ancient world, inheritance was really important. And we needed to ensure that there were heirs. And so maybe every male sexual act needed to be able to result in an heir. And so maybe that's what this is talking about. That's to say that these verses are vague, and scholars who spend their entire lives dedicated to this have a real hard time discovering what they're even talking about, or discerning what they're even talking about. And so but it has probably something to do with one of those, and that's why like lesbian sex is not condemned
Never
in the book of
addressed. That's something
Leviticus.
I bring up to people
Right.
because when you read
Yeah.
through the Old Testament law, when laws are given, especially sexual law, it's addressed to the man committing it and then addressed to the woman committing it. But there's this noticeable gap when it's addressed, gay homosexual sex, that women are never mentioned.
Right.
Never comes up
Yes.
anywhere. So it
Yeah.
has,
And so
go ahead.
I think it's because it has to do primarily, my own 2 cents, I think it has to do primarily with inheritance, right? And so if women were having sex, it didn't matter because there was no ejaculatory experience. There was no wasted seed that could
Well, and they
possibly
don't
result in
pass
an
on
heir.
inheritance, right? The women were part of the inheritance
Correct.
for the most
That's
part.
that's right. They were property. That's
They
right.
they
They were
didn't
they
have
were
anything to, give to an heir.
That's right. That's right. And so I think primarily when we're talking about stuff in the Hebrew Bible, that's what we're talking about. But we also see that like what we like to in the 21st century talk about like traditional marriage and traditional relationships. And really what we mean is like kind of puritanical norms. And we don't mean norms that are in the Bible, because there isn't really a single type of relationship that's lifted up as normative in the Bible. We certainly have, like marriage between a man and a woman, but we have all kinds of other relationships described there. We've got, like a man being married to multiple women. We've got a man being married to a woman plus a bunch of concubines. We've got slaves being married because the owner says so. We've got prisoners of war being married. We've got people getting married because of actions of sexual assault. There are all kinds of different types of relationships that are condoned by the Bible. So I think that the Bible is not a great manual for what relationships in the 21st century should be like, because pretty much no one in the 21st century thinks that all of those different models are great models for how relationships ought to
Want to
look.
mimic that? Let's not do that.
Yeah, that's right. Let's maybe not use those. So I think that's to say that when we look at the literary context and we look at the socio-historical context of what's going on, I think those arguments fall apart real quickly. And it's the same whenever we start looking at the New Testament. So let's take Romans, for instance, that Paul, whenever he's condemning acts of sex in the same gender relationships, he's really talking about relationships within Hellenistic culture. So if we read through Paul, and just as a side note, I do think that the Christianity taught by Paul is not the same as the
Yeah, there's
religion
some
taught
pretty
by
stark
Jesus.
differences in what he
The,
teaches. Yeah.
Yeah, there are. I mean, and I guess also just to say that, like, I'm not sure Paul is the person we should be looking to for a healthy sexual ethic either, because Paul thought that the world was going to end in his lifetime, and his advice to people was, "Hey, if you can avoid having sex, do that because the world's probably going to end. And if you don't think he can, then okay, go ahead and get married or whatever. But otherwise, please just avoid it. Avoid it
Just don't
altogether.
do it.
That's it. Don't do it." And so, like, clearly, Paul was wrong about that. The
Yeah.
world did not end in his lifetime. So, Paul probably isn't the best person to look to for healthy sexual ethic either. But in this case, when he's talking about men having sex with men primarily, but he does mention women as well, that we're often he's talking about exploitative relationships within Greco-Roman culture. And so it was normative, especially uh, for men, like older men, to take on younger men as sexual partners. And there was an unequal power dynamic there because the younger men often didn't have much say in whether they participated in that or not. And it was also true that the older men often took the place of dominance in that sexual act. And so in that culture, there was uneven power dynamic based on who had the position of dominance. And so Paul's whole thing was that power dynamics ought to disappear when one became a part of the body of Christ. The whole no Jew or Greek thing,
A
the
male or
power
female.
dynamics
And
of
like he
that's
was the
right.
person who nominated Phoebe to be a deacon, which
That's
is,
right. Yes.
yeah. And it's interesting to me, and I that falls in alignment with what I believe was he was very much expressing that an abusive power dynamic should not exist in the context of those relationships, but also how his verses are used to demonize the LGBTQ community. And his same verses, even though he's pretty clear about men and women being equal in the church, his verses are used. It's this focus on wives submit to your husbands, women need to submit, women need to be quiet. When in a lot of ways, how would you express those verses with people
Well, I
that
think
bring up that women should be subservient?
so. I think this is another place where, like, knowing literary critical stuff and historical critical stuff is real important because scholars don't think that Paul even wrote that stuff. So a lot of the letters attributed to Paul, there are three different categories of letters attributed to Paul. There are the Pauline letters, so the ones that he really wrote, and then there are like letters that maybe he wrote and maybe he didn't, and then letters that scholars all agree like that didn't come
Did
from
not write
Paul, even
this.
though right, even though his name's on it. And so even the Pauline letters, like say First and Second Corinthians, because a lot of those are in those two letters, that even though those are considered authentic Pauline letters, scholars also think that later editors came in and added stuff like the verses you mentioned about women covering their heads and staying silent in the church and all that stuff to conform to the later epistles, so the later writers' theology, because Paul clearly didn't think that. there
Yeah.
he writes to he addresses women, and it's clear that women were in leadership roles in the early church. And so I think that if we really believe that we ought to be looking to Paul as a source of knowledge, at least about what early Christianity was like, then it's important to distill those things out. Because are those verses problematic? Yes, of course they are. There's no way around those verses being problematic. They don't jive with what we know about the teachings of Jesus or about what authentic Christianity ought to be. But we also know that it's because the earliest version of Christianity was so radical that later Christians were like, we've got to tone this down a little bit. And so they add this other stuff because Jesus clearly was not concerned about oppressive gender stereotypes. He was always breaking those down
Yeah.
in his actions,
Consistently.
in his table practice, and in his teachings. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's been something that is interesting to me, as Jesus breaks these norms, even with the Samaritan woman, he crossed not just gender lines, but racial lines at the time,
Yes.
for then people to take these verses and apply them in a way that is so opposed to what Jesus said and what the authentic, like Paul's actual actions dictated. And what is your thought on, as far as historically, when did those kind of patriarchal systems get added back in? Because the way I read it is that, especially being in the Roman Empire, such a patriarchal society, the
Yeah.
Christians kind of altering their faith to fit better in that society, especially when it was declared the religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine. When do you think that those shifts really started to take place, versus being that radical, truly equal Christianity right after the death of Christ?
Yeah, I mean, it happened relatively quickly within the first 100 years because those epistles that we see later, that those were added within the first 100 years of Christianity. So I think we can say that the earliest folks, the people who actually knew Jesus, that they clearly knew that that wasn't authentic. But even the gospel writers didn't know Jesus. None of the gospels were written by people who had ever met Jesus. It just isn't possible. And Paul, by his own admission, uh, didn't know Jesus. So none of the stuff that we have in the New Testament was written by anyone who had ever met Jesus. So I think that that's important to say. But I
Hmm.
do think that pretty early on we see people toning it down, and I think that is in large part because they hadn't met Jesus. But Jesus's message was clearly pretty radical. And I think that's true when we're talking uh, about gender, like about women being involved in the church. But I think it's also true when we're talking about what today we would call sexual orientation and gender identity. And I think about those verses in Matthew 19 where Jesus is talking about divorce, right? And he's talking about divorce not because not I think in the way that we often think about it today, or it's often used today as like, oh well, you should stay married no matter what. So a lot of people talk about that, and that's not what Jesus is talking about here. Jesus is talking about divorce as a justice issue because in those days a man could dismiss his wife for something as trivial as burning dinner. And as you pointed out earlier, that women and children were considered to be property. And so women did not have inheritance. Women could not own property. And so if a woman was divorced, she was left with nothing. And so Jesus addresses this as a gender justice issue. He says, hey, there's got to be a real cause before there is a divorce because he's standing up for a marginalized group of people. So within that context, though, Jesus talks about different categories of eunuchs. And he talks about people who have been made eunuchs by others, right? Like men who have been castrated so that they can guard harems or be with important women and not get the women pregnant. And then he talks about people who become eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God, that is, people who have chosen to be celibate because they might belong to a monastic order or something like that. And then he mentions people who have been eunuchs since birth, which queer theologians tell us is a way of saying that anyone who deviated from the expected sexual orientation or gender identity at the time. I mean, they wouldn't have described it in that way because that's a relatively recent way of talking
Yeah.
about this. But anyone who deviated from what today we would consider sexual orientation or gender identity, Jesus is affirming in these verses where he's advocating for gender justice. And so I think that even even though the text might not say the might not be as explicit, as vocal as we would want it to be today, that if you do know the socio-historical context of the text, then it's there. That Jesus's love, the love of God that Jesus taught, is evident even buried in a text that is radically imperfect, a text that was written all these decades later, that you can still see the grains of Jesus in there. And I think that that's why it has been so enduring, uh, other than people using it as a tool for oppression, right? That's
Yeah,
clearly happened
that's
too,
that's
but
a
I
big part
think
of church history.
it
I
is.
mentioned to people as well, because I have these conversations a lot, being an
Sure.
ex-fundamentalist, Christian nationalist, the whole thing. My dad was a Republican state senator, like across the
Yeah.
board, it was a whole family tradition. But I mentioned to people that the word homosexual didn't appear in the Bibles until 1946, because the word
Yes.
itself didn't exist in the English language until 1867. So these are all new manipulations of the translation. It's not what the original text said. And also, the text wasn't written in our original language, it wasn't written to us, English speakers. So, everything from the cultural context to the way that they would phrase something is completely different than how we would understand it. And growing up in it, but being where I am now, it's heartbreaking to see people continue to weaponize it in that way when
Yeah.
it's so clearly out of alignment, in my opinion, with those grains of Jesus that we do get from the text.
That's a great point. And a couple points there that not only was it not written in English, although I love the joke, when people ask what version of the Bible you use, the King James version, because if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
That,
Wait, what?
because that's the way a lot of fundamentalists think about it. Like the King James version, that's
That's
Jesus's
the only
Bible. Well,
translation worth reading.
that's right. That's right. It's one of the most inaccurate versions. Although one of the fun things about that is, there's a unicorn in the in the King James version. And so I don't know if you've heard this story or not, but uh, there's so I had a professor who would ask people if they believed that everything in the Bible was literally true, and they said, "Yes, of course, yes." And he said, "Okay, do you believe in unicorns?" And they'd say, "No, of course we don't believe in
I
unicorns."
know.
And then he'd show them the place in the King James version where there's a unicorn. And then he would do a survey of the class, like a blind survey. And people literally changed their minds and like, well, it's in the Bible. Yes, I believe in unicorns. I
Oh
mean,
my
that's
God.
that's that's the mindset, right?
Yep.
So not only was the Bible not written in English, right, but Jesus spoke Aramaic and the Bible was written in Koine Greek. So automatically there is a translation from the language of Jesus to the language of the New Testament. Even the New Testament is not the original language of Jesus. So I think that's important. The other thing that I often hear is when I'm talking to LGBTQ plus identifying folks, those and I will say things like, well, the understanding was different, and so they didn't think about sexual orientation in that way. And I'll have people say, well, are you saying that like LGBT people didn't exist 2,000 years ago? I said, of course not.
Yeah.
LGBT folks have always been a part, like queer people have always been a part of society. It's just that society did not understand sexual orientation and gender identity in that way. That, as you pointed out, it's a relatively modern way of thinking about things.
And the
And
science we have
so
around it is brand new. Like within the past 50 years, for the bulk of it, is very new. And some of it extends, back to 1930s, but the real science of identity and what we can understand and articulate now is very, very new in relation to the length of science existing in its common form.
that's right. And we still are figuring out just very basics of human psychology, and there's so much we don't know that is still unknown. We're kind of in the infancy of a lot of these sciences. And so I think not only have we just learned some of this stuff, but we are still continuing to learn every single day about what it is that it means to be human. And so I think that our conversation will continue to shift. And I think that that's a really good thing. And so I think that's also a real challenge for a lot of churches, because even churches that are, say, open and affirming or are welcoming or whatever the designation is in those particular churches that welcome LGBT folks into the life of the church, that I think churches still have a lot of work to do, even if they claim to be welcoming spaces, because of the evolving conversation and the evolving understanding we have of what sexual orientation, gender identity means. So, for instance, the church that I serve in San Diego, it was the first open and affirming congregation in Southern California of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So that's something that we're proud of, that we did that early on, though. But when we went through the open and affirming process, basically the way that it was being talked about was, well, you're either gay or you're straight, and we want to welcome gay people into the church. That's what the conversation was at the time, right? That's how it was understood. So we weren't talking about sexual orientation as a spectrum, for instance, and that you weren't necessarily gay or straight, and that there's all these other possibilities. And we certainly weren't talking about gender identity. That wasn't part of the conversation. And so whenever I first started at this church, a lot of times I would have trans folks come and say, "Hey, I'm starting to transition and I want to be in a place that's welcoming. Is this a safe place for me?" And I would have to say, "Hey, look, the congregation is trying. The congregation welcomes everybody, but honestly, we've got a lot of work to do." And so then we took about the work of doing that, of learning. And I think this congregation has become a very welcoming place for trans folks. We have a number of transgender non-binary folks who have found this to be a welcoming place, but we had to do work, and we will continue to have to do work, because I think that that's something that's important to recognize as well, is that you don't just do something one time and then you're done with it and
Yeah.
like, well, I've checked the box and okay, I'm set. So I think that that's true about welcoming LGBTQ plus folks, but I think it's also true about our theology in general, that you also don't just like get to say, "I've got the perfect theology
Got
now,
it. I've
thank
got the
God.
Bible figured out.
I got it all
Done.
figured out.
Yeah.
That's it. That's it. That's all I need to do." And so I've checked off that box. No, it's a constant learning process. And so I think that faith should be ever evolving, and that we should never get complacent in that, because the second we've got it figured out, we're wrong. Like, nobody has the correct theology.
Yeah.
Nobody.
And we're
And
not going to
so
have all the answers. Like it's impossible for us to have every single right answer to every single question. It's not possible.
it's not, and I don't think that's the goal either. I think my biggest awakening, maybe in my spiritual journey, was recognizing that ambiguity is sacred, that the not knowing is holy, that the questions about faith, like asking them and thinking through them and being in conversation with people, especially people who have different perspectives, that is kind of what it's about.
Yeah.
And the resting assured and the knowing, I know a lot of people want that. They want to know the things. But I think if we're in pursuit of knowing the things and getting the right answers, we're missing the point, at least from my perspective.
And especially in our current climate, the Trump administration has really politicized the attack on trans people, and the
Yeah.
church as a whole has really armed themselves against the queer community as a whole. I mean, everything from claiming that they're groomers when like there's so much sexual misconduct in the church, and
Mhm.
claiming that drag queens are doing this and trans people are attacking women in bathrooms when there's no documented cases of that. Where do you think that vitriol and that animosity and that kind of hatred comes from? Like, why do you think that this is happening and it's so effective? Christians, fundamentalists get off on this.
Yeah, it's like that meme, right? That says, "Oh, I've just become a fundamentalist Christian, and now all I can think about is other people's genitals or whatever." Like
Exactly.
it's
Like
it's
you
a
think about our
weird,
genitals a lot more than the rest of us do.
yeah, it's a weird fascination. I think ultimately what it is fear of other. I think that's what it is a lot of times when we see all kinds of discrimination, when we see all kinds of oppression of marginalized communities, is that it's both fear of of something that is someone that is misunderstood, and it's also a fear of a loss of power. That like, okay, well, if so and so gets more rights, if the trans community is able to live fully, then I won't be in control. That I won't have as much power as a straight white cisgender man. And so I think that there's fear of losing power and fear of the other. What I think dismantles that is relationships. It is actually knowing people from other groups, other socioeconomic groups, other groups of people who identify differently in terms of sexual orientation or gender identity, the different racial groups, different cultures, different ethnicities, all of that. The way that we dismantle those stereotypes, that fear, is by knowing real people and by caring about them. And that's why I think, the campaigns where it's like someone you know and love is gay, someone you know and love is trans, that like, yeah, the places where I have seen people have a real change of heart, it's been because someone that they care about deeply, someone who they love, it is a part of that community, and so they have to reconcile their own beliefs within them with the person that they love. But I think that the fear mongering that's happening now is incredibly dangerous, and it is ultimately all about power, and it is kind of waving the fan at the fire of fear. And I think one thing that people can do if they want to authentically follow Jesus is to combat that with every fiber of strength that we have to say that this is inauthentic to the teachings of Jesus, and we're not going to allow our religion to be manipulated in this way.
Yeah, and I think that I love what you said about relationship. One of the things I tell other Christian friends of mine, some who are kind of deconstructing from fundamentalism, is that it's impossible to hate from an embrace. When you're
Mm,
holding someone and you see
mhm,
their humanity and you see how much you have in common, all of a sudden, like all these storylines you get told about them, whether it's the dialogue around trans people or an undocumented immigrant or the Democrats, right? Because I grew up in a church where Democrats are like eating babies. And you meet people and you realize that we're so similar. We're
mhm.
all fighting the same battles in a lot of ways. We're all beautifully human. We're all imperfect. And that, for me and my deconstruction was a huge part of deconstructing both my views on abortion and the queer community. And I realized these beliefs that I've been taught my whole life don't hold up in real life. Like I'm testing them in real life, and none of these things that I've been told are true. I think it makes me sad how the hateful rhetoric is so popular within the church right now. It's disheartening because
Yeah.
it's so in opposition to everything that Christ stood for. And my personal belief is that the hold on the anti-queer rhetoric in general is in large part because the fundamentalist church is so patriarchal. And if you
Mhm,
allow this expansion of gender and gender roles and what role does gender play, it destabilizes their strict belief of like who serves, who doesn't. And the back of the fundamentalist church is built on women. Women are the ones doing the free labor. They're cleaning the church without getting paid. They're running the VBS. They're doing all these things, unpaid labor. And I think that the expansion of the gender conversation destabilizes that power dynamic that the fundamentalist church relies on to be able to function, which is again, it's so sad. And it's sad that women continue to buy into it as if they're somehow not equal in God's eyes, which is like I would not want to serve a God who thought that I was less than because I'm a woman. It's like you made
yeah.
me. You wouldn't, a good God wouldn't consider me less than just because of that. He made me this way for whatever reason. And when people, like me or people that are coming from conservative backgrounds, if they're approached by a family member who says, well, I really believe this is wrong. I believe that the Bible is against this. How would you encourage them to respond to that conversation? Because I think that those conversations need to happen, even if it just plants a seed of doubt. but also coming from someone that you're a family member with, someone that cares about you, gives you the opportunity to share those things. How would you encourage people to talk to a conservative family member who approaches with that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of ways. I think it's good to say, hey, you love me and I identify in this way, or don't you love so and so and they identify in this way?
Mhm.
How can you reconcile that? I think it's good to challenge people like that. I think it's also good if we're talking about this from a religious perspective. I think it's good to just know the clobber passages and how to dismantle the arguments because it's not an argument that you're making against them. It's fact that this stuff is manipulated and is taken out of its context, and it does not mean what people want it to mean, like what fundamentalists want it to mean. It is not hateful clobber passages against LGBT folks. It just isn't. So I think that if we use then theological arguments like okay, well, Jesus told us to love. How can you love and and condemn people? Or I think another way of approaching it is asking, if we're all created in the image and likeness of God, in the book of Genesis, a lot of people like to talk about original sin, but
Yep.
Matthew Fox talks about the idea of original blessing, that in the first creation story, because there are two, right? And then the first creation story, God looks out at everything and says, "This is good. We have created humankind in our image, and it's good." The Imago Dei, that we are the image and likeness of God. And so, if we are the image and likeness of God in our diversity, then how can we condemn someone who's a part of the LGBT community? Or how can we condemn an immigrant? Or how can we condemn someone who has a different skin color than us? Or how can we condemn someone who has a different religion than us? Or how can we condemn someone who comes from a different culture or speaks a different language? Because we are all of us in the image and likeness of God. And when we are condemning another person, we are not condemning a person, we are condemning God. And so I think that, like, it's okay to put those people on the defensive too, to say, actually, you're wrong about that. And that's not the correct biblical interpretation. That's at least that's what I always do when people come and say, well, what about this, this, and this? I said, well, you're not interpreting those correctly.
Yeah.
That scholars uh, agree that that's an inaccurate way of translating that. And you can believe whatever you want, but what you're believing is wrong.
Is
And
factually
so
inaccurate.
it is factually inaccurate. And so you are choosing, if you choose to believe that, you are choosing to believe something that just isn't right. And so I think that telling people that is helpful for them they whenever people hear that kind of stuff, they recoil at first,
Yep.
but then often they go and they think about that and they're like, wow, why do I believe this or whatever? Or they double down. And those are the people whose minds you're not going to change anyway. And so I think another thing that people just have to make a decision about, especially people who are part of vulnerable populations like the LGBT community, is that like sometimes you have to choose on whether or not relationships are worth maintaining. And
Yep.
sometimes it is terribly painful to say I cannot be in this relationship anymore, even with like say a parent or another loved one, to say I cannot be in this relationship anymore because it is harmful to me, it is harmful to my soul, and I'm sorry, but I can't do it. And people have to make that decision for themselves, if it's more healthy for them to not be a part of it, because there are some people's minds who you just can't change. And that's just an unfortunate reality that people, I think, have to uh, think about on their own and decide what's right for them.
Yeah, and that's something I encourage with my followers because I encourage the conversations and I encourage education and know these things, have these conversations, but I do caution them like if you know someone who is hateful and they are openly racist or homophobic and they
Yeah.
engage in like this violent vitriol and you know that they're going to double down, don't waste your energy, and two, don't put yourself in danger because sometimes when you challenge people's beliefs that they have now made part of their identity, they take that as a personal attack. And so it's not worth putting yourself in
Yeah.
danger emotionally, spiritually, physically to have those conversations. And I think that that is important, that know who is open enough for you to have a dialogue with versus someone who's never going to change their mind. They're just going to double down and beat you over the head with the King James Bible and the unicorns and know when to walk away. Because there's just some people that they just won't change. And it's become such an integral part of how they identify themselves that they can't let it go.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And I mean, I'm a straight white cisgender guy, right? And so I also recognize that like one of my jobs is to use my place of privilege to talk about these things, to be in situations, uncomfortable situations like that, and to challenge people because as an ally and as a person coming from a place of privilege, that's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do. Uh, that said, like we've in our family have had situations where we've thought, well, you know what, these family members are just not people that we're going to be around anymore because we just do not live our lives in the same way, that we have fundamentally different values. And even though they might claim to be a Christian, not not by any measure of following Jesus that we can determine. And so we've decided, that we're not going to do that. And so I think that that's also something interesting about Donald Trump, for instance, is that this is something that, evangelicals have clearly chosen to 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 elect someone who is not a Southern evangelical, for instance.
Yeah,
And this has happened
he's not
before.
even in the ballpark of Christianity.
No, but I
Like
mean, this is
different, like, go ahead. I'm just like stuttering because it makes me so upset.
it is infuriating. But I mean, this has happened before, right? Because in the late 70s, Jimmy Carter was a Southern evangelical. He was he was a Southern evangelical, and he was a Democrat, but he was a Southern evangelical, and he believed in the same way that most Southern Baptists did in the 1970s before kind of the fundamentalist takeover. And Southern evangelicals ditched Jimmy Carter for Ronald Reagan, who was not really a person of faith. He actually belonged to my denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, growing up, but he wasn't religious. He had to be coached on religious language before he went because the right had done such a good job of partnering with fundamentalists that they changed the narrative on
Mhm.
that. And so the same
Yeah, him and his
thing with
wife
Donald
had
Trump.
quite the reputation in Hollywood for certain things that were not Christian activities.
Yeah, and I mean, he was in Ronald Reagan and his wife were married at a Disciples of Christ church. So I mean, I'm just saying, like he was not an evangelical, and they ditched a real evangelical with Southern evangelical values for someone who aligned with their political beliefs instead. And
Yep.
so that this has happened before, and it certainly happened with Donald Trump. You're right, he's not even in the ballpark. And I think it's significant that in 2016, when he was running for president the first time and claiming to be a Presbyterian, a part of the Presbyterian Church USA, that the stated clerk of the denomination, which is their highest office in that denomination, said, hey, not only is he not a Presbyterian by any measure of this term, but he is not a Christian so far as we can tell.
Yeah,
And so I think that this is just clear evidence of the fact that the right has so manipulated the religious conversation that really people don't even care if he aligns with any
clearly
values
not.
or not.
Because
And
that's
and
another
I
thing
think
I
it
bring up when people, come to me and again, the attack is always against gay people and trans people, especially. And I'm like, well, how do you feel about adultery? And I'm like, oh, well, that's wrong. And because the Bible talks about adultery a lot more than it even alludes to same-sex
Mhm.
relationships. And they'll be like, oh, well, that's wrong too. And I'm like, okay, so why do you support this man who's cheated on every wife he's ever had? He's had multiple
Yeah.
wives. He's cheated with a porn star, paid off a porn star, and then the people that started
Yeah.
worshiping Elon Musk. And I'm like, this is even worse. Like, you're literally shooting your own foundation of what you say you believe. And, I keep asking them, I'm like, do you stretch before those mental gymnastics or do you just
Ah!
go for it? Like, do you, like, because it's the cognitive dissonance is just so stark. And I'm just, I can't, because that was one of the things for me. Many of the people that I grew up with or that were contemporaries of my dad. My dad was very involved in the church. And, we used to hear these men, mostly middle-aged and up white men, rail about adultery and committing adultery, and especially if a woman did it. And then now it doesn't seem to be a problem. I'm like, I
I
remember
think
growing up, you guys would talk about this all the time, like with hatred and vitriol and spittle. And now you're really quiet.
I think that's just further proof of the fact that this really doesn't have anything to do with religion at all. That it's been kind of caped in Christian language, but it's really not. It's about hate and fear and
Power.
power
It's
and
about
money.
power and money. It's always been about power and money.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you
And
know,
so it's and how people can accumulate more and exploit people further. And I do think that the right did a good job of manipulating people who really did have religious values, but reframed certain conversations to turn people into single issue voters. And so I think abortion is a case in point that the right really did do a good job of reframing the narrative on that, even though there's not really a biblical case for that either. But they did such a good job of co opting the language that they made people think that they had to vote Republican or else they were voting against Jesus and they were voting for death and murder and all that. And
mhm.
so I think that they did do a good job of manipulating people in that way. And I think that they also have done a really good job of getting uh, people who have immigrated into this country to vote against other people who are immigrating into this country as well. That they've really framed the narrative in that in an unhelpful way. And so the Republican Party has really just had an uncanny ability to get people to vote against their own self-interest. I think that's something that we've seen
Paul
time and
Weyrich was
time
a
again.
genius when he had them pick up, after they lost the battle for segregation, having them pick up abortion the way they did. Because most people don't realize that the Southern Baptist Convention released three church-wide edicts after Roe was passed, supporting a woman's right to choose, saying it's between her and her doctor. The Bible, like we support this decision. And then
Yeah.
when Jimmy Carter said, you can't have segregated Christian schools, the whole conversation changed. And then Jerry Falwell gave his, famous anti-abortion message in 1978. Before that,
Yeah.
it wasn't an evangelical issue.
That's right. In conversation with Paul Weyrich, who also came up with the name of Focus on the Family,
Yeah.
right? Like that was his brainchild
Mhm.
to stir this religious fundamentalist arm of really the right wing politics
Yep.
is what it's always been about. And that's what I like to say about religion generally. That religion in and of itself isn't good or bad. It's just a tool to make sense of the life in which we live. Whether it is a tool used to upbuild society or a weapon used to tear it down is up to whoever is using it, right? And so I think religion can be an incredible tool to help us create a more peaceful, a more just place. That if we are, say, following the teachings of Jesus about an equitable society for the marginalized, if we are calling out systemic oppression and speaking the truth and love to the principalities and the powers, that if we are doing that, then it is a tool for the upbuilding of society, what Jesus called the basileia of God, what Martin Luther King Jr. called the beloved community, that this vision for the future that is better than what we've got now, that I think religion is helpful. But you've also got the Paul Weyrichs of the world, the Jerry Falwells of the world, who are using religion in such a way that they really upbuild their own power and they are not doing anything that is consistent with Jesus other than stealing power and oppressing people in Jesus' name. And that's really the only connection that it has with with Jesus.
Yeah. And you bring up Focus on the Family and James Dobson. And people don't know that James Dobson was tutored under Paul Popenoe, who was an atheist, racist eugenicist, who he created the foundation of Christian marriage counseling. And the only people that were extreme enough to take his policies on were evangelical preachers. So the foundation of Christian marriage counseling comes from a racist eugenicist who wanted more white babies in the world. And
Oh, well, thank God that didn't translate into any family dynamics or anything like that,
right,
right?
thank
They
God that didn't happen. Oh my God. When you, the journey of deconstruction and you start to discover these things, especially coming from
Yeah.
the type of environment I did, I found myself pacing a lot. I'd be like, what? What? Are
Yeah.
you kidding me? Just yelling what into the ether as I found out all this information. And
Yeah.
especially in our time now and just all the craziness that's going on, what is your hope in this time? Because, it's really discouraging and a lot of terrible things are happening. What is your hope in this time for both like the believers for America? What's giving you hope right now?
Well, I mean, I think my hope in general is that democracy persists and we don't further descend into fascism. I, whenever the election was happening in November, my daughter, she's 9, and she was learning about the political process in school. And so we were talking about the election, and I've always been very transparent about who I'm voting for, what I'm voting for, and why. I just think that I'm transparent about that in all aspects of my life, with my kids, with my congregation, with just everybody. That's just how I live my life. And so we were talking about the election the night before, and my daughter was asking me who I was going to vote for, and I had been out of the country, and I was filling out my ballot and taking it because we can do that in California. I was filling out my ballot, and I was taking it, and I was dropping it off. And so the next morning she came downstairs and she said, "Dad, who won?" And I said, "Well, Donald Trump won the presidency." And she said, "Well," she's like, "that's really bad, but at least it's only for 4 years, and he can't run again because this is his second term, and it'll just be 4 years." And I said, "Yeah, that's right," thinking the whole time, maybe if he ever gives
I
up
was like, I
power,
hope so. I hope so. I hope so.
because I'm not convinced we're going to have another election.
I'm not sure
So
I
my
will
hope.
either. I think that it will be very fortunate if we get to have any kind of fair election again.
Yes. Yes. I think you're right, because we have seen this happen all over the world in places where democracies have been destabilized. So I think, like, just my hope for the world, my hope for this country is that this country hangs on to some semblance of democracy. But where I'm finding hope is people who really are grounded in the authentic teachings of Jesus. And so I think that both authentic Christianity and progressive Christianity, I feel like are finding their footing here. That I think that, like, Christianity in general in the United States has really been fumbling to try and figure out what it is, and whether what its relevance is. But I think in times where you have a clear thing to work for, that you are able to articulate beliefs in maybe a more meaningful way. And so one thing that I think we have started seeing is a real convergence of different Christian groups who are really interested in the social justice teachings of Jesus, coming together and trying to speak the truth to the principalities and the powers. And I think obviously the most visible example we had of that was Bishop Buddy
Yeah.
talking in her.
And
I mean, the fact that she so gently suggested that Trump might want to think about caring for all citizens in this land. Like, that's all she said, and that he had such vitriol to that, I think was just a prime example of how even a soft-spoken, genuine Christian witness can really highlight the inequities of this world and this administration. That I am finding hope that that Christians can unite together to work for real good, but also maybe that in terms of interfaith work, that there is a path forward for interfaith work as well, because I think one thing that's been challenging in the past year and a half has been that interfaith relationships have really fallen apart, primarily because of the issue in Gaza, and that we've seen a lot of division. We've seen, Zionists really stake their flagpole in the
Mm.
ground, and that has really caused a lot of problems in terms of local interfaith work. That we've seen interfaith spaces really divided between people who want to stop the genocide in Palestine and people who are are standing in favor of the Israelite oppression. And so I think that ultimately a lot of us can't control that situation, but we can uh, find ways to work together on local spaces. And so I think it's been real unfortunate that we've seen local spaces, interfaith working spaces that have historically been very good
Yeah.
fall apart. And those relationships have fallen apart. I've lost relationships because of things that I have said in favor of Palestinians. And so I think that it is just time for us to find at local levels ways to work together again. And I think that that's my hope for the future.
Yeah, and I'm just got a couple more things and then I'll let you go. But one of the things when my account started gaining a really strong following, I was getting a lot of messages from the queer community about like, thank you for making me feel like God doesn't hate me. Thank you for letting
Mm.
me know that I'm not an abomination and even stories of like near suicides, like just
Yeah.
devastating stuff. What would be your message to the members of the queer community who have been either taught that they are an abomination or they're hated by God or that they're not worthy and have been so damaged by the church? What would be your message to them?
You are exactly who God created you to be. You were created in the image and likeness of God, that you are a perfect reflection of God, that God created all sexual orientations and gender identities, and you are loved and affirmed. And anyone, any church, anything that tells you different is inauthentic to the teachings of Jesus and is not compatible with the gospel. That the gospel is all about love. And if you are around people who are telling you something different, it's a lie. It's a lie that you are created in the image and likeness of God. And so I think that any relationships that are between consenting adults and are not exploitative, that those relationships are affirmed by the teachings of the gospel. And I can say that from all my years of study, from all the discerning that I've done, from everything that I know about history and social sciences that have been brought to the gospel, everything that I know about Jesus tells me that you are who God created you to be. And so I think it's amazing that when people hear that message that they are created in the image and likeness of God and fundamentally good, that that's something we all need to hear.
Mm.
That we all need to hear that. And so that's what I would say today.
I love that. And can you just let people know where to find you, both your church, if they're in the San Diego area, and any social media that they can find?
So yeah, sure. So you can follow me across social media platforms at Reverend Dr. Caleb J. Lines, and then I serve University Christian Church in San Diego, and you can find us on our website, or you can find us on we stream everything on Facebook and YouTube. I also serve as co-executive director of progressivechristianity.org. It's the Center for Progressive Christianity. And so if you're interested in this approach to Christianity, then that's a great place to go for progressive Christian resources to find out more, to read articles, and to create liturgy if you're in church spaces, and to find our five core values that reframe what it means to be a Christian. We don't have creeds, but we have core values of what it means to identify with this type of Christianity, which perhaps might resonate with you.
And I'll include all of those in the show notes as well. And before we wrap up, I wasn't planning on doing this, but I feel like I should. Would you just end this podcast with a prayer?
Sure.
Let's do it.
Friends, will you pray with me? Holy source of all life, we feel you connecting us, each of us, no matter who we are, no matter where we are from, no matter where we are listening to this at. We know that you are the source of connection between us all. May we lean ever deeper into you as the source of love and let that love, that acceptance, that affirmation guide our lives so that we can upbuild your basileia, your reign on this earth, so that it might be more peaceful, it might be more just, and so that the marginalized might be lifted up as Jesus instructed us. May it be so, and thanks be to you, O God. Amen.
Thank you so much. Maybe I don't know why that made me tear up, but it did. Reverend Dr. Caleb Lines, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for your insight and your wisdom. I'm really excited for this to air, and to share with everyone. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.